Welcome to Robert Sungenis Live. This program coming to you today on February the 8th, 2023. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever, and I, as my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, the Fathers, the Scripture, the saints, the doctors, the catechisms, the encyclopedias, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every Wednesday from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And usually at the top of the program, I have a topic to cover, but no topic today. We will just be taking your questions. So if you haven't had a chance to have your question answered, which is usually the case every time I have this program, because I can only get about 1/3 down the line of the questions that come up on the chat board. So if you ask a question, make sure you put the word question in capital letters before your question so that when I breeze down the scroll, I can see that is a question, and I will give it top priority. Let me see. What else? Try to ask, 2 or 3 questions at most so that others have a chance to ask their question. And other than that, just be nice and kind and loving, and those are the only rules on this program. So, I do have one mail-in question that I will attempt to tackle here. And let me give it a read for you. I hope you all enjoyed last week when we had Michael Voris on the program. He did an excellent job, as you know from watching the program. Told us all about the ministry he has there in Detroit, Michigan, Church Militant, and all the other sub-programs that he has. And we wish him well. We pray for him. And someday in the near future, we will have him back on the program. And we'll go more in depth on exactly what he is teaching at the Church Militant. And we touched a little bit about that on the last program, but we'll go more in depth the next time. So, oh, yeah, one advertisement. I almost forgot. We have ordered our DVDs for How the World Was Made in 6 Days. This is day 1. And we're going to have all 7 days. So you can imagine what an intense project this is. And my guess is we will still be making them at the end of this year. And maybe by 2024, we'll have all 7 of them made. This one is an hour and a half long, covering the first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 1. And all that entails, of course. All the other scriptures that are related to it. And, some philosophy about hermeneutics. That is how to interpret the Bible and all that. So I think these DVDs are $15, and you can buy them here, pre-order them. They should be here next week or the week after. You can order them from me. You go to robertsongenis.org, and I think you will see them there, and or the Colby Center. The Colby Center.org also has them. So you can buy them there as well. And we split the profits. So it doesn't matter where you buy them. But they are available now on streaming. So if you want to stream it, go to the Colby Center. They have the stream link. I don't have it on my site yet, but we'll have it in the future. So just wanted to let you know things are moving up, and it is available. Okay? All right. Now, let me get to this question here, and then we'll get to your questions on the chat board. I was sick again on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I'm just getting over it. But if I am coughing, it's because I'm at the tail end of it. And I just had some basic, bacterial infection. Sometimes you just can't avoid it. But the best way to beat that is bed rest, believe it or not. All right, so here he says, Robert, I am 46 years old, so I'm not exactly young, but boy, that makes me feel old. Gee. You're 46, buddy, so you're in middle age, okay? You're not old. All right, and I'm old enough to have seen plenty of life. I've been around the block a few times. I am very observant. I am a very observant person who likes to rationalize everything. I think he means to think rationally, not rationalize, because rationalize means you're trying to find an excuse for your behavior. I think rationally about everything and use logic. So I really struggle with science. I admit I am nowhere near some science expert. I am also nowhere near some Bible expert. But science really challenges me intellectually. At times, I almost feel insulted. Okay. My biggest problems are with the numbers. Billions or millions or hundreds of thousands or even thousands. Sometimes even hundreds. Do people not realize how big of a number billions are? Am I really supposed to believe in this almost infinite numbers? My mind gets blown away like it's worse than any science fiction story I've heard. It's more of a fiction story to me than people who try to make God into a fiction story. Am I really supposed to believe that things like bones and other things, etc., can actually be found and still exist after so many years, and that I can actually be measured by how old it is, and that it can actually be measured how old it is, and that humans were basically mindless beasts, and that it's an accident that the human bodies, both male and female, are this perfect with all its tools and reasoning. Is this by accident? When normal people start spewing off about single cell organisms, that type of talk, I almost want to slap them because they have no idea what any of it means. It's like people are brainwashed to believe something they can't even begin to understand, and they act as if they do. How can any normal person even begin to understand any of it? When I read the Bible, church teachings, history, etc., it's almost perfect on every intellectual level. All anyone has to do is look back every 10 years and see drastic changes. Forgive my ignorance. As I said, I am nowhere near any type of expert. Perhaps you can comment on any of this and maybe I can learn something. Well, I hope I can help you there. What is his name? John. Okay. So, yeah, I think, John, what you're feeling is what a lot of other people have felt, which is the exorbitant numbers that are used in science today, especially, see, I'm already starting to cough here, so be aware, folks. And sometimes it comes in spurts. I'll cough about 10 times and then it'll go away. Then it'll come back with a vengeance, saying, you didn't cough enough, so let's hope that doesn't happen today. At any rate, Yeah, scientists have this kind of aura about them, and they feed into this aura, which is that they are the intelligent ones, and they have things figured out in their science theories and all that. And it does make the rest of us look like, like we're ignorant. And yet, when you say, as you say, we read the Bible, everything seems so simple. You have God creating the world in 6 days, and then he creates Adam and Eve, and they fall into sin, and you see how sin comes into the world. And we have an answer for sin. Why are we evil? Well, the Bible gives a pretty good, simple answer. Adam started the ball rolling, and it hasn't stopped since. So that's a good answer. It has an origin point. It has a reason. Because he was deceived, and we know what the motives are. Jealousy, pride, you name it. That all makes sense. You put it all together, shake it up, and it comes out making a lot of sense. So we have an answer for that. We have an answer for death. The rest of the world doesn't. You would think if you're an evolutionist and you believe in this secret mechanism of upward progression, that is, every time there's another organism made, that organism is supposed to be better than the previous one, until you reach this point where now man has come and he's superior to all the other things that were created, but yet he dies. So where does death come from? I mean, if we're supposed to be progressing and keep progressing, there's no limit. Why does every organism, every carbon-based organism, die? From animals to parameciums to goats and human beings, we all die. And as a matter of fact, the Bible even says that it's predicted how long man's going to live. In the early days, Adam lived to 950 years old. And that's true. He did. And the people that came after him for a length of time, they all lived hundreds and hundreds of years. And then after the flood, the ages started to decline. And that's because the earth changed and the climate was not as inviting and supporting as it was before. And so we have an answer to that. Abraham lived to 175 years. Joseph, Jacob's son, lived to 110 years. And then you see it go down and down and down, because these are the effects of sin. That's why Romans 5:12 says, when Adam sinned, sin and death came into the world. Okay? And so we have an answer to that. It's so simple, isn't it? You don't have to climb high mountains or tread deep seas to find these answers. It's all written down for you. So as you say, it is very simple. But the scientists, because they have rejected God, 90% of our upper level scientists are atheists. They think that since they discovered atoms and molecules and the DNA molecule, for example, that as what's his name, who discovered the DNA molecule, Watson and Crick. Watson said when he discovered the DNA molecule, now I know there isn't a God. Okay? Why would somebody, because if I looked at the DNA molecule, the double helix with the 4 amino acids all in different combinations, and each different combination answers to a different part of, why my hair is dark, and I have blue eyes, and I'm 6'2", and it's all because of my DNA. When I look at that, I'm just amazed that someone can even think up something like that. So it tells me that there's an intelligence behind it. But guys like him, you see, they start out as atheists, and then they discover something like the DNA, and so what are they going to think? Yeah, well, now I know there's not a God. And what's he really saying? He's saying, these guys back in the Middle Ages who were all very superstitious, and they believed in bloodletting, how to cure someone of their disease. You stick something in and make a hole, and you let some blood out, and that was supposed to let the evil demons out, you see, because they thought that the demons inhabited the blood. Okay, yeah, that is superstitious, okay, but that wasn't the only thing they believed. They believed a lot of other things, and the science of anatomy and medicine, really didn't take hold until the 1800s. But so, yeah, there is a big difference between a scientist in a white lab coat today and some medieval theologian who thinks that, the demons are in the blood. And the Catholic Church never taught that, by the way. Okay, that was just an ancillary idea that some other people had come up with that weren't not associated with the church. The church had probably the best scientists that the world produced, at least in the early going. As a matter of fact, we were talking about the DNA molecule. The whole idea of genetics came from Mendeleev and Leeuwenhoek, very true Catholics. So for somebody like Watson to say, well, now I know there's not a God, it just shows you that his atheism has overtaken him. He doesn't even give room enough to think that something so complex could not make itself. He just can't go there. And I think I mentioned this last week. There is a geneticist, evolutionist who just died a couple of years ago from Harvard named Richard Lewontin. And he said, yeah, look, we know our theories don't work, but we're materialists. And what he's saying is, we don't believe in the spiritual world. We believe only in the physical world. And so we have to make our theories based on the physical world without any interruption from, the spiritual world. And for that matter, there is no spiritual world for him. And so he says at the end of his paragraph, so we cannot let a divine foot in the door when we're making our theories. Okay. So you see this divide, and they don't come right out and say it. Like when he writes a book, he doesn't say, I don't believe in God, never did, never will, and all of my theories are based on that foundation. He won't come out and say that in his book. If he does, it'll be it might be implied, or it might be suggested possibly, but he won't come right out and say it. Okay. Because most of the rest of the world has an idea of God, and in their hearts, they know God exists. So if you start out with this, God does not exist, and then you try to understand the world, well, you've got two totally different views, worldviews, that are going to, they will hardly ever overlap as to giving the meanings and origins of how things came to be. So don't be bamboozled by them. Don't be influenced to the point where, oh, these scientists, they work so hard, they got all these fancy equations, and they They make all these theories and blah 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 blah. My father was a medical doctor. He wanted me to be a medical doctor like him, and I am so glad I never did. First of all, I can't stand the sight of blood. And second of all, I can't stand the smell in a hospital. And third, I told my dad, look, I can be much more valuable for humanity's sake in dealing with man's soul rather than the body. The body's going to go someday, no matter what you try to do for it. And sometimes medical intervention actually increases the death rate. I mean, I've read books on this too, where more people die in the hospital of what they call hospitalitis. That is all the germs floating around in a hospital. More than what they came into the hospital for. Okay? That's a fact. So, and once I asked my father, I said, Dad, on a scale of 0 to 100%, how much do they really know about the human body? Now, my dad, sometimes he exaggerated, but at least he was honest with his own profession. And he said, they know about 2% of what goes on. 2% out of 100%. Okay? Not very. Now, this was what? I don't know, back in the mid 20th century when I asked him this. And then I said, and then he added this. He says, 80% of the people that come into his office, and I saw them because his office was right next to our home. And 80% of the people that come into his office, he can cure with a good talk and some aspirin and send him home. And I always knew when my dad had a talker in his office because he would actually bring him into his main office and he'd sit and talk to him. And he did office hours at night, including the day. So he did them in morning and night. Afternoon, he went to the hospital and the nursing homes. But at night, if my dad got through at about 11 p.m., first question my mom would ask him is, did you have a talker in there tonight? And yeah, he did. And, but he could send them home cured because the problem was all up here in their head, you see. So, but he said, let's be honest, 20% of those people really do have something wrong with them. And, I've got to be able to diagnose it and try to give them medicine. But that's why they call it practicing medicine, because they don't exactly know what's going to cure these people. I mean, let's say we take antibiotics. Everybody's heard of antibiotics for a cold. And I don't do that anymore. Because what that really does is those antibiotics kill the bad infection along with all the good cells that you have in your body. Okay? So by the time you're done taking that 10-day prescription of antibiotics, whether it's penicillin or erythromycin or whatever it is, and I know them all because I used to do lab tests for my father. He used to give me, he would take samples from the person's mouth, put it on an agar plate, and then I would put 10 different medicines on the agar plate to see, and that took days to find out which one of the medicines was killing off the bacterial infection that they had. But by that time, the people were better anyway. So it's so you can see why they call medicine a practice. Because now, of course, if you have a broken arm, yeah, you need someone who knows what they're doing to put that arm back together and put the cast on and not make any more things broken. And so there are things you do need medical assistance for, okay? If you're bleeding, you need to stop the bleeding, or else you're going to bleed out and you will die, okay? But that just makes sense. It's a common sense. I always laugh at these, you got a quadruple bypass. And the prognosis for the person who has a quadruple bypass is you may live 3, 4, or 5 more years. That's it. So you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, whether it's you or the insurance company who's got to foot the bill, and the person lives, 3, 4, 5 more years, and that's it. So a lot of it's all based on money, and my father fell into that trap as well. You know that if you diagnose the problem and you recommend a remedy, that remedy is going to cost money. You get your commission for that or whatever. And selling drugs. My gosh. My father used to have a closet. Now, this is not your typical broom closet. This is a closet that probably could be used as a room to sleep in for somebody else. And just hundreds and hundreds of different pills that the insurance companies or the drug companies told you were going to cure such and such a problem. Because see, they all believe in evolution, so they all believe that everything's chemically based and that your problems come from a alteration of your physical balances, and the pill is supposed to, put it in balance again. And that's not including all the side effects that you will get. I don't know if you've ever listened to these commercials on TV today, but some of them, for a simple problem that you may have, skin rashes or whatever it is, and they'll say, well, one of the side effects here is, what's one of them? Side effects are coma, possible death. There's something else they said, I forget what it was, but I'm going, what the heck are you saying? See, by law now, they're required to give you the side effects. They weren't before. Okay. And of course, they say it very fast. Side effects, and you got to be able to catch it. And then they got the small print down at the bottom of the commercial that you can hardly see, let alone read. So it's a big racket with these drug companies. And we all went through a lot of that with the COVID-19. And, they're all racing. Why are they all racing? We had 5 or 6 different major drug companies all racing to get a vaccine, the cure-all, the vaccine. And even vaccines have now come to the point where in Japan, they won't let you take these vaccines anymore. Okay? Because the vaccine itself can do harm. And, so you've got all these question marks around how they're treating people. Why? No, like my dad said, they know 2% of what's going on in your body. Okay? Now, maybe a little more. Let's say it's 10% or 15%. Maybe even 20%. Who knows? But it's a lot. They want you to believe that it's a lot more than it really is. Okay? So here, again, like Lewontin said, look, we know our systems don't work. But we're committed materialists. And we're going to keep using the same kinds of theories over and over and over again. And hopefully, some of them work. Okay? So it's like hit or miss. You never know what you're going to get from these people. And so don't be bamboozled by them. Okay? You know, the doctor in the United States used to be a god. You graduated from medical school, had an MD next to your name. You were like a god. People treated you like you're something special. Okay? If they really only knew what they're teaching these doctors, and because all these doctors believe you came from apes. That's why they wanted to tell you that your tonsils were an appendage that shouldn't be there. And now we find out later that the tonsils are the very thing that helps keep the bacteria from going down your throat into your system. Your appendix, that was some appendage from when you were an ape that you don't need now. And we know that appendix, yeah, it does. It takes the poisons out of your body so you don't die and stores them in the appendix. Yeah, it gets big because some people have a lot of poisons in their body. That's because they take in a lot of poisons. Okay? So, in the food we eat, my gosh, the chemicals that are in the food we eat today is just mind-boggling. You ever read those labels? Okay? So, it's the food companies now that are in on it. Everybody's out to make money. And you can only make money if you can sell your product. And you got to sell a lot of it. And it never ends because everybody wants to get rich. So this is a problem with capitalism. Okay? Now, capitalism also has its good points because it gives them an incentive. But there are many, many drawbacks to the capitalist system when it gets integrated into all the product level exchanges that we have. So, that's why the Bible is very simple, isn't it? Very simple. And speaking of remedies, what is the statistic? I think it is somewhere around 75% of our medicines come from natural substances. Okay? In other words, substances that God has already made for that very purpose, for medicinal purposes. And it's just a matter of finding out what plant, tree, or whatever can give us a certain remedy to a certain disease. Okay? And so in that sense, the Bible is very simple too. Okay? Why did God make all variety of vegetation? Some to eat, some to give medicine, some to build houses with. It goes on and on. So that all again makes sense, doesn't it? It all fits together. So I told my doctor, since I'm getting up in age and I want to make sure at least I have the facts in front of me that I can judge how far I want to extend my use of doctors. I told my doctor, I said, "Doctor, I have never been in the hospital except for once when I was 5 years old. I had strep throat because my father forgot to clean out the pool and I drank the water. And I almost died. But I'd never been in the hospital after that. I've never seen a doctor for a checkup, except when I got married, because I had to have a clearance. That I was a, happy, normal, healthy male specimen to get married. And I said, and look at me. I'm healthy, and I told you, and I hate to tell you this, Doc, it's because I've stayed away from doctors. Of course, he laughed. And, but I'm telling you, I learned that from my father. My father would not go to the hospital. He would only let doctors that he knew examine him if he had a problem, okay? Because he knew what a mess the medical industry is. So it's all about money and prestige and power, and I mean, it's a mess. So, but yet, they're needed. There's a whole, what was it, chapter 15 in, I think it's chapter 15 in Ecclesiasticus or Sirach, which talks about doctors, how God has given us doctors. Now, these are the old days, though, okay? These are the old days where doctors used their common sense and not quadruple bypass to fix your problems, okay? So doctors are good. They can be very good, but they also can be very bad. And when they get into a bad society like we have now, every area of society is affected, whether it's government, law, medicine, science, you name it. So that's why you're confused when you look at all this stuff, because they all have their astronomical numbers, don't they? And it makes it, they all have their equations, and it makes it all look all very impressive, okay? And but most of them don't know what they're talking about. I'm just telling you from my experience. They don't know what they're talking about. And you got to be very judicious, very careful about what you listen to and what you think is the truth. You really, the consumer has to vet it out as best he can. And if you have any doubt, then it's better not to go in that direction. Okay? So, I hope I made you feel better. All right. So let's go to our board here and see what's on your mind. All right. Remy says, how do we know and prove morality comes from God? Because atheists say we don't need God to have morality, even though they're unknowingly living by a lot of Christian standards. I hesitate to get into this, Remy, because it just seems so natural and obvious to me that a man who is evil, like this atheist, is making judgments about what is good. Okay, that's the first irony that we have here. The second is that every man can spout off whatever he wants to try to make himself independent of God. But when he's put in the pressure cooker, there's the old saying, there are no atheists in foxholes. Why is that? Well, when these bullets come whizzing over your head when you're in the foxhole, you know that one of them could be meant for you and you will die. Okay? And it's at that point that men start to reevaluate their judgments in that pressure cooker and begin to say, oh, yeah, there really is a God, isn't there? Okay? So, or let's take the example where the man is sitting at home with his family, watching a movie, and someone breaks in the front door with a AK-47 and points it at all of them and says, here are my demands, fulfill them or I'm going to put this bullet in your head. Okay. You see, that's when men start to say, oh, yeah, I see that we can be evil. We can make the decision to be evil and hurt other people. Okay. So there he has another sense that to do good or to do evil, excuse me, is a decision that each man makes. Okay. But he has to also understand that he wasn't born a man, he was born a baby. And a baby really doesn't know anything, does it? He knows when he gets hungry and he will cry. He knows when he gets hurt and he will cry. He knows that certain people give him what he wants and certain people don't, and he will become attached to those that do. Mommy and daddy, for example. Okay. So he is in a learning process. When he becomes a toddler and another kid comes over and takes the candy out of the kid's mouth and puts it in his own mouth, well, he knows that somebody did something bad to him, and he starts crying, or he may go over there and give that kid a punch and take back his candy. Okay, so he's in a learning process of good and evil, and he has a brain capacity, of course, to sort all these things out and comprehend what's going on. Okay, and then when he gets older, he's a teenager, and he starts smoking cigarettes, let's say. And he knows that's wrong because his parents have told him it's wrong. When he gets caught, he feels guilty. Okay? Or if he takes drugs, he's going to feel guilty. And, so on and so. So again, he's in a learning process. So the knowledge of good and evil is a development process. It doesn't come to you automatically. And if, let's say, you grow up in a society where all they do is evil, well, that's all you're going to learn. Okay? This is what happens sometimes in the slums, or, where you get a lot of people who have no means, and all they know is evil, stealing to get what they want. And so that's what you're going to grow up as. And so that's what you learn. And so, again, it's not intrinsic. It has to be developed. There are certain things that are intrinsic. You have a soul and you have a brain that can help you sort these things out. And it's the old nurture versus nature argument. Which has the more power in developing human beings in their knowledge of good and evil so that we can have a safe and productive society? Okay. So, but all these things have to be learned. So they didn't come from the man, did they? Okay. And then you go back in time, and that man was a baby once, and that man was a baby once, and so on, until you get to the first man, Adam. Okay. Now, how is he going to know not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Unless he has a sense given to him by God, because we know it doesn't come automatically, so that he can decide to obey God. Well, that has to come from a higher being. Okay? Because we've just proven that it doesn't come from the man himself. Okay? So it has to come from a higher being. And then you get into areas where, let's say the commandment says, thou shalt not kill. Okay, that's easy enough. But is that true in every case? No. Why? Well, because that same source that gave us that morality tells us that there are exceptions. One exception is when someone commits a capital crime. Adultery, homosexuality, murder, high level of thievery, you will lose your life. They will take your life for that sin. Okay? So there's an exception there. Is there an exception? Other exceptions, yes. Like when you're trying to defend yourself against someone who's attacking you. What do? Just stand there and let them stick the knife in you? No. You have the right and the duty to protect yourself. And if it comes to the fact that you have to kill him to stop him because he's not going to stop, that's called self-defense. Okay? And you're exonerated in the justice system for that. So it's not a sin. Okay? But somebody has to tell us what these exceptions are. Otherwise, we would not know. Okay? And on and on and on, you have the whole Pentateuch is full of giving us laws and their exceptions and what to do in difficult cases. Okay? And that's because God gives the answer. And the closer a society is to God, the more God will give his wisdom so that we can decide in difficult cases what to do. Okay? Sometimes they even had in the Old Testament, they had the ephod. Now, the ephod was a priestly mechanism. I don't like to use the word mechanism, a spiritual tool, let's say, that he could use to contact God. And he knew that God would say yes or no, not maybe, or let me think about it. He would give him a yes or no. So the priest would phrase this question to God, and God would give the answer, yes or no. Okay, so you have to use a little wisdom in how you phrase your question, knowing that God's only going to answer yes or no. But they had that resource. So in difficult cases, they could go to God and say, we don't know the heart of this man. He killed somebody. It looks like it was an accident, but we're not sure. And they could contact God and he would tell them what the truth was. Okay? So, again, you have that. So anybody who thinks that we've developed this sophisticated, complex system of jurisprudence and behavior, personal behavior, out of thin air is just fooling himself. Okay? He's just another Watson who looks at the DNA molecule and says, now I know there's no God. Okay? Same kind of mentality. And they, unfortunately, will forever be with us. So don't think this is the last time you'll run into somebody like that. All right. Tomb Fire says, can you explain what it means to fear God? Since we're supposed to love God and he's a loving being. Okay. Well, God certainly is a loving being, okay? But that's not all that God is. God is a just being. And just implies or dictates that whenever God sees injustice, then he has to fix it. Okay? And if the fixing involves getting rid of the one doing the injustice, like you or me, he will do so. Okay? And there are passages in Scripture where God says he hates evildoers. Okay? And we don't have to mishmash with that. It actually means God hates evildoers. Psalm 5, verse 5, Psalm 11, verse 5, and there's about a dozen other ones that say the same thing. Okay? Why can God say that? Well, because God's a personal being. He's a personal being, and personal beings are either going to be honored and appreciated for who they are, by those with whom they are associated, or they're going to be dishonored, okay, or insulted, or not appreciated for who they are, okay? This is what we have to remember about God, that he's not just being. Because if you say God is being, you've only really described half of what God is. The other half is that he is a personal being. And you know what that means because you're personal. Okay? If I were to yell at you now and call you names, you would be insulted, would you not? Okay? If I were to speak kindly to you and adulate you, you would feel very good and feel very close to me, wouldn't you? Okay? Why is that? Because you're a personal being. A personal being can be insulted or honored. You can call names to a rock all day long, and it won't matter to that rock. Why? Because it's an inanimate, impersonal object that has no feelings. Okay? Has no personality. Okay? So you have these two sides to God. Love, kindness, pity, compassion on one hand, justice, hatred of evil, punishment for evil, all that kind on the other side. Okay? So when you know that, okay, then on the love side of God, and when I say side of God, I don't mean to decompartmentalize God, because God's all one personality, just like you are. But like when you were raised by your father, if you did, he said, go out and cut the lawn, and you cut the lawn, and you came in hot and sweaty, and Dad, I cut the lawn. Very good, son. Did a great job. I'm proud of you. Here's $10. Okay? So you see the loving side of your father. All right? Now, if your father told you to cut the lawn, and he went out to the hardware store to get some tools or something, and he expected the lawn to be cut by the time he got home, and he sees you watching TV, sipping a Coke, he's not going to be very happy, is he? Okay? So now we're going to see him get angry, and he's going to punish us for disobeying him. All right? So there's the other side of your own father. You see that. God's the same way. Okay? Exactly the same way. He's just perfect in everything that he does. Whereas your father may have mishandled something sometime and, punished you to excess or didn't punish you at all. That's wrong also. But God's perfect. Everything he does is without sin, without lying. It's always the best thing to do. Okay? So, and this is required by God. If he didn't do it, then he wouldn't be honest with himself. And that can't be. Okay? That's the whole definition of God. So, when you fear God, okay, and many times in the Hebrew and in the Greek, the word fear and reverence are interchangeable. Okay. Fear is, and this is very important because what does Solomon say? He says, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. That's pretty succinct. Okay? The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. And you'll find other times in the Bible and even in common expressions where we'll see somebody evil and the description of that person is they have no fear of God. They have no fear of God. And I think Paul even uses that in Romans chapter 1. He says they have no fear of God before them. Now, fear of God means that you know what God is capable of doing if you do wrong, and that he must do the remedy because he's God, and he can't skimp on anything. He can't just shove it under the rug. This is why St. Paul in Hebrews chapter 12 says, if you're going to be a Christian, well, you better know that God's going to discipline you. He's not going to let you get away with any misbehavior. Okay? And so what does that do? That instills fear in us of what God is capable of in punishing us. Now look, if God punished the whole human race because of one man's sin, Adam, okay, and it wasn't something physical, it was just an exchange of intellectual ideas that was going back and forth. And the devil said, hey, you can become a god. Just eat this piece of fruit. See, I can become a god. Wow. So it's all intellectual. He's thinking about this. And for just those thoughts, okay, which thought eventually led to doing something physical, eating the fruit, okay, and that just basically consummated what Adam had already thought in his mind, that he could become a god, okay. That's all that was. So all of that was his big sin, all his intellectual thoughts that he consummated. And for that, the whole human race is in sin and death right now, some 6,000 years later. Okay, so you know that this God is not milquetoast. Okay? He means what he says, and he says what he means. And if you get caught, if you succumb to evil, the the boom will come down on you. Okay? Now that's a being to fear. Okay? And there's really no other way to say it. That's a being to fear. And yet, on the other hand, we know that this very God who will judge us and punish us relentlessly if we sin. And what does this tell us about God before I get to the other side? Everything that we are, that God is, that God wants, that we should want, is to be righteous, to do the right thing. That's it, period. Okay? That's who God is. When Isaiah says, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God. I am a man of unclean lips. I cannot even stand in his presence. What is this telling us? That this God we worship has one thought in his mind, and that's to be righteous. Never to sin. Never to do anything evil. Okay? And he created us in his image to be just like him. Okay? And if we refuse to, then that is the ultimate insult, the ultimate dishonoring to God. And he will punish relentlessly. You will see how terrible God can be. As it says in Hebrews chapter 10, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. Okay? So, if you are living a moral life, a sin-free life, and you can do that, just be happy that you are in that state. Okay? Because that's when you are really like God. But if you're not, then yes, you ought to fear God. Okay? Because just as loving as he can be wrathful and angry. Okay? And that's just the nature of God. That's exactly what we would expect. If God was all love and never got angry or wrathful against sin, what kind of God would that be? That would be some pansy. Okay? And our God is not a pansy. Go read the Old Testament. Find out. Okay? That's one thing God is not, is a pansy. That's why he gave us those stories in the Old Testament, to let us know how angry and wrathful he can be. Okay? There was one instance where David is carrying the Ark of the Covenant with, they had wheels, and priests were moving it up the mountain or some, I forget where they were moving. And I think one of the wheels broke, and so the ark was about to fall over, and a soldier of David's, Uzzah was his name, came up to the ark to stop it from falling. Because who knows what would have happened if it tumbled over. The ark might have tumbled down the mountain. So Uzzah comes up there, and God strikes him dead right there. And David's looking at this and is wondering, God, why did you kill him? Okay. Now, you have to read between the lines here, but what you figure out is this guy, Uzzah, was at a place where he shouldn't have been in the first place. He was up walking by the ark, and that was just for the priests only. And somehow Uzzah was there, a soldier, and shouldn't have been there. So it appears that Uzzah was trying to make a name for himself. He thought he was more than he was, and therefore he should be able to be up with the Ark of the Covenant and show how great he was to the people, because there were all thousands of people there. So God knows this about Uzzah. He knows what's in his heart, why he's doing this. He's not doing this to be, just in case something might happen to the ark. He's there to make himself look prominent among the people, as if he's a big deal. Okay? And one thing you can't do with God, there may be other people making big deals of themselves who aren't, and God doesn't destroy them right away, of course. But when you try to use the holy things of God to make yourself look like you're special in your heart, and you know that's what you're doing, you see, God knows all those thoughts. He knows what your motivations are. Okay? So this is the kind of God we have. So you can never fool him. You can never put a pretense of righteousness or holiness on and think that you're fooling God. Okay? I could go on and on and on about this topic. It's just, who is God? Who is this guy? What does he want? And he's not going to let it go. He's going to squeeze every drop out of it that he possibly can before the end. And he has his ways of doing it because he made us. He knows us. Okay? And we just cannot fool him. So, get your heart right with God, and you won't have to worry about his wrath and anger. But that's what fear of God is. Okay? That's why it's the beginning of wisdom. Because once you know that you cannot put a pretense on in front of people to make yourself something that you're not, okay, that's wisdom. And where does that come from? It comes from the fear of God. Why? Because you know God knows your thoughts. You know that you know that he knows your motives aren't pure. Okay? And if you really did fear God, you wouldn't have practiced those motives. You'd shun them as soon as they came into your mind. Okay? So, there you go. All right, question. Why are other Catholic YouTubers always say that Catholicism is judeo-christianity? Well, I think there's two sides to that story. One is that, the Jews were the place where salvation was to be found before Jesus and the apostles and all the Christians of the New Testament came. Okay? That's what Jesus said to the Samaritan woman in John 4, verse 22, that Jerusalem was the place of salvation. Okay? No other city, country in the world could make that claim. So if you want to call Judaism the religion of the Old Testament, it's sort of as a general term, maybe, but Judah didn't come into prominence until after the 10 tribes have gone to the north, were dispersed into Syria. Then you had Judah and Benjamin left, and the prominent one there was Judah. And that's where the word Jew comes from. Okay? So what you had at the end of Jewish history basically was Judah. Okay? As a matter of fact, that's where Hebrews says that Jesus came from, the tribe of Judah, not the tribe of Levi. And so he's of the priesthood of Melchizedek, not of the Levitical priesthood, which makes him totally different. Okay, so we see the name Judah, Judea, all those terms were floating around, and it was a good way to describe basically what was left of Old Testament Israel. Okay, because as I said, the 10 tribes had been dispersed in 722 BC. And Judah and Benjamin, they were sent to captivity also in the Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And they came back under Ezra and Nehemiah. And they rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, basically, rebuilt the wall. And they were not half the people they were prior to that. So, there was a struggle. But at least they existed. Okay. And then at that time, you had the Maccabees come in and they resisted the Romans, and these were all Jews. Okay? And then Jesus comes on the scene. Jesus is a Jew. Mary's a Jew. Joseph's a Jew. All right? And each Jew at that time knew what tribe they were from. At that time, well, you had a few stragglers, like somebody could be from the tribe of Asher. There were not many of them because they had been dispersed, but mostly you were either from the tribe of Judah or the tribe of Benjamin. And Paul himself was from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay. So these terms pretty much stuck. Now, when you get to the Pentecost, you had 3,000 people at Pentecost get baptized and become Christians. And they were all Jews. There may have been a couple of Gentiles there, but most of them were Jews that had been scattered probably around 15 different nations. Okay, living in 15 different nations, but they were still Jews. And they had to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year. One of those times was Pentecost. And so at that time, you get all these Jews who may or may not have known about Jesus. Most of them probably did, but you probably get a good portion, maybe a third or so, who didn't know about Jesus because they were living in these other nations. But Peter preaches a sermon in Acts chapter 2, a hell and damnation sermon, if there ever was one. And 3,000 Jews become Christians. So they're Jews. So they're from Judah. So they're like judeo-Christians. Okay? So that makes sense. Okay? So using that term can fit as long as you're doing it historically. Now, today, that term has become politicized, okay, unfortunately, where those who use Judeo-Christianity are not so much looking at the historical dimensions that I just gave to you, but they're looking at political dimensions as they fit in today, in an effort to make the Jews of today, the modern Jews of today, who are not Christians, somehow tied to Christianity, because we used to use this term Judeo-Christianity, and it made sense back in one part of history, in the early part of the church, and they're trying to give it the same kind of luster in our modern times. Okay? Now the question is that proper? Because these Jews of today are not like those at Pentecost, where they converted to Christianity. Okay? So that we could see the tie-in between Judaism and Christianity into a new religion in Jesus Christ. The Jews of today want nothing to do with Jesus Christ. There's a very few, and we call them who do Messianic Jews, but they're very small in number. And most of them are Protestant, by the way. Okay? So the only legitimate reason you could use Judeo-Christianity today is if there were a lot of Jews who became Christians today and became leaders in the church or whatever, but we just don't see that. Okay? So there's this sort of misnomer when we use Judeo-Christianity, because the Jews, if any, are a very small percentage of the Church of Jesus Christ. Okay? And Paul warns us about this. This is going to happen. Okay? Because when he's discussing Jewish conversions in Romans 11, and he points to himself, his conversion to Christianity, as evidence that God has not rejected the Jews and that he's still saving them, okay, even though God rejected the nation at large, which happened, when the temple curtain was torn and at the cross, and that was the sign that things were divided now, that things were going to change, and that the Jews would come under judgment, which they did in 70 AD under the Roman Titus. Paul says, even though I became converted to Christianity, being a Jew, and it's open to all Jews today, if they want to believe in Jesus Christ, let me give you some historical facts. Even in their heyday, in the time of Elijah, around 800 BC, in a nation probably of 5 to 10 million people, there were only 7,000 who were the Christians of that day. Okay? 7,000 out of 5 to 10 million. So he says, look, the number was small in the Old Testament of real believers in God among the Israelites. Okay? And he says it's the same today. In Romans 11:5, he says, and so there is a remnant today who are saved by grace. In other words, we have the same percentages that you had in 800 BC in Elijah's day. You got the same today, in his day, Paul's day, which forecasts for us pretty much what we're going to see the rest of the time before Jesus comes back. There will be Jews that will be saved, but they will be a small percentage. just like it's always been. Okay? So, that's if that's the case, then there's not a big Judeo part of Judeo-Christianity, is there? Okay? So that term has become quite different than what it was historically, when the first Jews of the Christian church were all Jews. First Christians of the Christian church were all Jews. The Gentiles didn't actually become added to the church until about 15 years after Pentecost. And we know this when Paul says in Acts 13, toward the end, he says, since you don't accept the gospel, and he's talking to the Jews, we will go to the Gentiles. And there was a demarcation that had never been made before, but now it was made. Okay? So something happened. And you got all these Jews at Pentecost, and then over 15 years, they go right back to where they were before, unbelieving, unaccepting, critical. And they haunted Paul. Every city that he went to, these Jews and Jewish leaders mostly, and then some followers, would try to disrupt whatever Paul said to the people. Corinth, Galatia, Ephesus, Colossae, everywhere they did the same thing. And they actually had a term applied to them called judaizers. Okay, judaizers. Those that were trying to make Christianity into a Jewish framework. And Paul would have none of that. Okay? If you're going to become a Christian and you're Jewish, then accept the Christian faith as it is taught in the Catholic Church. And don't try to change it. Okay? And we've had a lot of those come along. They think just because they're Jewish and they become Christian, that somehow they're blessed of God more than anybody else, and they can start rewriting the rules of Christianity. No. Okay? That's not the way it works. They are lucky to be regrafted into the olive tree, as Paul says. Okay? And he says in verse 23 of Romans 11, he goes, and God is able to regraft them into the olive tree if they stop their unbelief. Okay? So it's not going to be some magic fairy dust that God, sprinkles on the Jews just because they're Jews. No, they're going to have to come to Jesus Christ just like everybody else does. You put away your sin, you put away your unbelief, and you accept it. Okay? That's how it's going to happen. And even then, Paul says, history shows that we're only going to see a remnant of Jews do that. And that's exactly what we've seen for the last 2,000 years, hasn't it? Okay? So what I'm saying is be careful of those who use Judeo-Christianity, because they're trying to make the Jewish people into something that they're not. Okay? Just because they're Jewish, somehow they have their own covenant with God, and God's going to save them in his time. They don't need to hear the Christian gospel. They even have their own Messiah, their own version of the Messiah, for Pete's sake. Okay? All this is a bunch of lies, just a bunch of lies. And so be careful of that. All right, let me move on here. You said that the footnotes in the NAB are garbage. I like how people paraphrase my words. What footnotes should I read instead? The NAB, for those who don't know, is a New American Bible. They had a version come out in 1971. They also have another version in 2011, which is not much different. It is a Catholic Bible, but it is written mostly by liberals. And so you're going to get all the liberal interpretation as opposed to conservative, traditional interpretations of Scripture. Okay? So things like, a talking snake in the garden is questioned. Noah's floating boat with all the animals is doubted or denied, one or the other. Samson and his strength is going to be doubted or denied. Anything that has the ring of either miracle or some extraordinary event is going to be doubted or denied by the footnotes in the NAB. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to get a conservative commentary. Okay. And we have the Pay commentary, which is very good. We have the Oxford, who's that written by? Can't remember. It almost was there, and it slipped out. So you want a good Catholic commentary, good conservative Catholic commentary. Okay, now you can go read the footnotes in the NAB. Do yourself a favor, go read them. All right, and you verify what I said. Okay, and then go read the notes in the conservative Catholic commentary, and you'll see the difference. Okay, you'll see the difference. You can get Cornelius Lapide. He's got some volumes on the epistles and 4 volumes on the Gospels. Get him, he's good. You can look up what each father said about a particular verse of scripture. You can do that on the internet now. Okay? What was Augustine's interpretation of Genesis, 4:17? You can find that. Okay? And you'll see that they're a lot different than the footnotes in the NAB. So do some research for yourself. Go find out. Okay? This is how you're going to learn. All right? All right. Hubert says, what? Let me get a drink of water here. I hope I last the next 35 minutes. All right. What is the credibility of radiocarbon C14 dating? And why is the difference between age of rocks dated that way so big? All right. So first of all, C14 is an isotope of carbon-12. There is a little C13, but not much. So we get a lot of C14. It's when C14 decays, it decays into carbon-12 or carbon-13, usually carbon-12. So there's a couple of extra electrons floating around in the carbon cubicle that, in order for the carbon to become stable, they want to get rid of these couple of extra electrons. And so they come off intermittently, okay? Because nature has been built to try to be stable, okay, as best it can. And if something's unstable, it's going to do what it can to make it stable. So carbon-12, makes up diamonds and coal and all kinds of things. So that's the stable form of carbon, and that's the form that can be used. Speaking of which, that's interesting because, if diamonds are formed by pressure, which is what evolutionists believe, and they've been around for millions of years, well, there really shouldn't be any more C14 in a diamond. And yet we still find C14 in mostly all diamonds. Okay. It's not hard to find. Which says what? It says that the diamonds are young because they haven't gotten rid of all their C14 yet. Okay. So there's another piece of evidence on our side. And you say here, why is the difference between age of rocks dated that way so big? Well, rocks are not dated by C14, by carbon testing, radiocarbon. Okay. Radiocarbon is only for organic specimens. Okay. Organic specimens are built on carbon cycles. Everything's based on the carbon atom, in other words. Okay. You'll get hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen combined with the carbon because it can combine in so many different ways that you can get so many different kinds of organic specimens, humans, apes, flowers, trees, all kinds of things. They're all carbon based. Okay. Organic chemistry is basically chemistry of carbon, the chemistry of carbon. Carbon's built in such a way where it's got the atom and it has 4 places, north, south, east, and west, in the atom where other things can combine with it. Other elements can combine with it, oxygen, hydrogen, whatever it is. Okay. And so if you got that many places where you can hook in something else, some other element, you're going to get a lot of variations. Okay. And then carbon has this kind of structure where it can be made into a very solid what do they call it? Hexagonal structure where it's practically unbreakable. Okay. And that's what a diamond is. That's why it's so hard. But carbon can also get the form where you get layers of carbon on layers of carbon. And they easily slide off of one another. And that's what's in a pencil, graphite pencil. That's why a pencil can write. Because when you put that pencil on the paper, you're sliding off carbon atoms. So you slide off one layer and another layer and another layer and another layer. Well, you might slide off 1 billion layers of carbon in just writing your name. Okay? Well, so carbon is very functional. And that's why, again, we can have so many different kinds of inorganic and organic combinations in the carbon atom. But radiocarbon dating does not date rocks because rocks hardly have any carbon in them. Okay. And the carbon is not organic. It's not, in other words, it's you have to have a version of C14 in the rock. Now some rocks will have carbon in them, and they will let go of the C14, but they're not many. Okay. So rocks generally aren't dated by carbon 14 method. You'll get rocks to be dated by potassium-argon dating, which is probably the most popular, but not so much these days because they have found very big anomalies in potassium-argon, where the isotope of potassium will then form into argon 40. And so if you know the rate of decay, then you can and you get that from a Geiger counter when you put it next to the rock. You get the rate of the decay. The way it's supposed to work is you have an equation where you put this data in and it'll tell you how old the rock is. Okay. Well, the reason I can say that isn't very popular these days because when they did potassium-argon dating on Mount St. Helens, which exploded, the volcano that exploded in 1980, okay, and they saw the lava come out and form, and then it cooled about a year later, and it was available for testing. It said it was 2.5 million years old. So something's wrong there, right? Yeah, the rate's wrong or the assumptions are wrong. Something's wrong. Okay. So, but then you have about half a dozen other kind of rock dating, elemental decay paradigms. And they each have their pluses and their minuses. Okay. But the big thing about them all, they're all based on assumptions. Okay. They're all based on assumptions that can't be proven. So there you go. All right. Benji Odo says, can you explain what and who are the Freemasons and their goals? And have you heard the rumors that President Truman sadly was a Mason, nuked the 2 Japanese cities because of Catholic growth? Well, we don't know that for sure. What we do know is that, yes, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were 2 of the largest Catholic populated cities. We do know that. But they were 2 of the most industrialized, modern, and if you were going to measure their threat level, capable of attacking the United States with, their own A-bomb. Okay. So strategically, they were targets in warfare, not necessarily because they were Catholic. Okay. I mean, that is just a rumor that has taken on a life of its own. Okay. Masons are, I wish John Salza was here. He could tell you all about them. They've been around for a while, a couple hundred years. And these were guys who they didn't want to come under the one characteristic of a Freemason. He does not want to be under the Pope. Okay? And you found a lot of these kinds of mentalities coming from Europe at the time of Christopher Columbus, Ponce de Leon, Magellan. We were discovering a new world, right? The old world was under the Pope in Europe. And he didn't have to stretch too far because Europe's very close to extend his power. Okay? Now, we had one guy who broke away in the 1500s, Henry VIII, who was one of the best Catholic apologists that existed at the time, who became King of England, and the Pope told him he couldn't divorce his wife, and so he killed his wife. And now that's the legacy of the Anglican Church. And so what do you expect out of the Anglicans? Oh, they're going to be more threatening and dastardly than even they thought the Pope was. Okay? They're going to be laying down laws. And King Henry VIII, he found out the hard way that the Pope's job isn't easy. And when you have to control a whole country, you're going to have to lay down a lot of laws. Because if you know, people are going to take advantage of you. And so he laid down a lot of laws, and people got sick of him. And they got sick of his tyranny. Okay? And the kings and queens that came after him, same thing. Okay? So they wanted to leave, start on their own. And they knew they didn't want to be under the tyranny of Henry VIII. They knew they didn't want to be under the Pope. Okay? And so a lot of them became Masons, what they call Masons. These were the guys that were going to filter out the religious hierarchy out of a good society. because religious hierarchy was too oppressive to them, too meddling, to this, to that, for their tastes of freedom. That's why they're called Freemasons. They wanted to be free of all these ecclesiastical religious laws that were emanated from Europe. Okay? So the best place to do that was this place called America, where things were just starting out. Okay? Now, they did have competition from a lot of the churches. Catholics, not so much because they were small in number, but the Anglicans, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, they all competed. Okay? And who was going to be the king of the hill? No one knew. So, but they had the advantage of not being in a religious denomination. A lot of these Freemasons. Okay? George Washington was a Freemason. Thomas Jefferson was a Freemason. Most of those guys who signed the Constitution were Freemasons. Okay? So these are the guys, the intellectuals of the day. Ben Franklin, intellectual. Okay? The intellectuals of the day who thought they were a step above the religious societies, because the religious societies use God as a crutch. And, we're big, we can pull ourselves by our own bootstraps, and we can make our own laws. And how do you think we got the three forms of government? So that's all Masonic. It's all Masonic. If you don't believe me, go down to Washington, D.C., and look at all the Masonic buildings that are erected in honor of all these Masonic laws in our Constitution. Okay? Yeah, they're all Masonic. You don't see any kind of European flavor in them at all. Okay? If anything, they are hearkening back to the days of Rome and the Greeks. Okay, with their columns and all that stuff. So they're sort of retrofitting. Somehow the churches got in the way of the Greeks and the Romans, even though the Greeks and the Romans had their big problems. And we're going to resurrect them, you see, and bring them into the modern age and make them even better than they were before. And we don't need any of the church stuff in order to do that. Okay? The only thing that the Freemasons would allow, as far as God was concerned, is that God existed. Okay, but there was another branch of European religion called deism. And that's, if you had to pin a denomination on Freemasons, which one would it be? Most of them either favored deism or were deists, like Ben Franklin was a deist. Okay, and what kind of God do you believe in? You believe in a God who created the world and wound it up somehow where it would move on its own, and you as God would go off into Never Land and let the earth and everything in the cosmos run on its own steam until eventually it would collapse, whenever that would be. But it's on its own. And so men are on their own to make their living prosperous and the best they can. God has nothing to do with it after that. So no 10 Commandments, no Jews, no Christians, that's all made up, they say, by these Christians who want to make God part of their reality. And as deists and Freemasons, God is not part of my reality. God is away. Where he went, no one knows. And for a deist or a Freemason, no one cares. So we're left on our own, and we make our own laws, and blah, 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 blah. And of course, we have rules for our society. And the other thing that they benefit by is that, look, as Freemasons do today, if you're a Freemason, you're in a Freemason club. Okay? And what do men do when they go to a club? Well, they drink, they play cards, they smoke cigars, and they talk about business. And by the way, John, did you know that I was a lawyer? And if you ever need legal help, here's my card. Okay? And then John, in turn, would turn to Sam and say, hey, Sam, did you know that I was a bricklayer? Anytime you need bricks laid for your for your buildings, give me a call. And so you'd have this camaraderie established of exchanging businesses that would thrive because now they're all in the same circle. They wouldn't think of calling anybody, some Catholic named Joe, who's an even better lawyer than John. Okay, why? Because he's not a Freemason. So a lot of Catholics were cut out of societal business because the Freemasons had a market on it. Okay, they thrived on that kind of stuff, and it's the same thing today. Okay, and a lot of Catholics were tempted to join Freemasonic organizations for that very reason, because they were being cut out of the business and found it hard to survive, especially when Catholics were having 5, 6, 7, 8 children per family. Okay, so I hope that answers your question. All right, let's see what else we got today. Question from Peter. Is the church's understanding of its dogmas infallible, as dogmas themselves are? Prophets spoke infallible, but this doesn't mean that their understanding of their own words was infallible. Okay, so let's deal with the prophets first. And you're referring to that passage in 1 Peter where prophets wrote down, not understanding what they were writing. I know which passage you're referring to. And that was in their own time. But see, that's prophecy. Prophecy is not dogma. Okay, so in other words, dogma doesn't look into the future. Prophecy looks into the future and says, this person is coming in the future. Okay, so the person who's writing the prophecy, let's say Isaiah, and he talks about Emmanuel, and Isaiah, who's Emmanuel? Okay, well, I mean, he's not going to know who Emmanuel is until Emmanuel comes, right? And he's not coming until what? 600 years later. And then it's, oh, that's Emmanuel. Okay. Because Matthew is writing in Matthew 2:14, this is Emmanuel, God with us, Jesus Christ. And so he fulfills Isaiah 7:14's prophecy. Okay. So you're mixing apples with oranges here. Okay. Dogma has a purpose for both the present and the future. And it's the same purpose. It doesn't change. Dogma says this is right, whatever it is it's talking about. Or this is wrong. You could say that also. And that will be true here, now, in the future, on Mars, on Jupiter, on Alpha Centauri, anywhere its effects go, and at any time. Okay, that's the nature of dogma. Totally different than prophecy. Okay, so we may have different applications at a future time of a certain dogma. Okay, and that's only to be expected because we have new things we have to think about. or we have new things that we're confronted with in the modern society. For example, who ever heard of surrogate motherhood? Okay, well, maybe they actually did in the ancient times. Hagar was like a surrogate mother to Sarah, so that's a bad example. Well, let me try one more complex. In vitro fertilization. Okay, they sure didn't have that in Abraham's day. Or genetic engineering, or labor disputes, or I don't know, you name it, that we have in our complicated modern society. If the dogma that was taught in the 1300s can apply to a certain new situation in the future, so be it. Okay. If it applies, it applies. Okay. So what the problem is today is that those who see these modern ideas want to say that because they're different than what happened in the 1300s, then the dogma, the religious dogma in the 1300s, has no practical application in the future in modern society, and therefore modern societies neutralize the dogma. Okay? No. The church is saying no. First of all, the church's dogmas are related to faith and morals. Okay? We're not talking about the cosmos or microbiology, or whether we can figure out Pythagoras' fifth theorem. Okay, we're talking about faith and morals. So the field's limited. So there are not going to be that many situations that come up in modern society that are going to be different than they were back in the 1300s. Because why? God's the same, the Bible's the same, the church is the same, the angels are the same, everybody's the same. Nothing's changed. People die, people sin, and they sin the same things that they sinned back in Sodom and Gomorrah and everywhere. Okay? So there's not really a big difference between what the situation was in the 1300s and what it is today. Okay? Except you may get something like in vitro fertilization. And who's going to decide whether that is going to be connected to a dogma of the church? Well, the church is going to decide. Okay? And the church can say that in this statement that was made in the 1300s, it's broad enough that it can cover the issue of in vitro fertilization. Okay? Or contraception, for that matter. Okay? So, see, the problem is today we have so many ways to sin. There's so many ways to sin. And courtesy of the internet. You can look up how to sin on the internet, and it'll spell it all out for you. How can I commit contraception? And they'll tell you. They even sell pills that will abort your baby within a couple of days of you getting pregnant, over the counter. And I mean, so what the modern society brings us is the multitudinous ways to sin that can all be constrained and filtered into basically the same sin that was being practiced before. Okay? And just a new method. That's all it is. So, as I said, there are very few instances, if any, in modern society that can't already fit into the dogma of faith and morals that has been taught by the church. I don't know of any. Okay. See, if you can think of one, let me know, and we'll talk about it. But all right. We've got 9 minutes to go. Question from the Duke of Sahib. Hey, Duke, how's it going? All right. When a Protestant says that Scripture is the sole infallible authority, what other infallible authority can a Catholic bring up to refute the Protestant? Well, you have two. That's called the magisterium of the Catholic Church. That's the Pope and the bishops. And you have tradition. Okay? And it's not just any tradition, it's apostolic oral tradition. It's limited to that. So the tradition has to stem from the apostles. Okay? Now, how do we know they're infallible? Well, let's do the infallible magisterium, first of all. Okay, what did Jesus say to Peter in Matthew chapter 16, verses 18 and 19? So you are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Okay, that's the first in verse 18. In 19 it says, whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Okay, verse 19. So let's look at what that passage means. Okay, if heaven says that it's going to bind it, if Peter binds it on earth, and we know that heaven can't lie, okay, or misdirect people, what does that mean about what Peter says? Well, that means Peter can't lie. Okay, so this is the impact of this passage. If you really think about it, heaven's putting itself on the line. And the only way it can do that is if it knows for sure that Peter's going to be telling the truth, which means what? He's infallible. Okay? Now, someone might say, but not everything Peter says is infallible. Like what he says in encyclical isn't infallible. Yeah. But remember what Jesus said. He said, whatsoever you bind. Okay. Now the church has said, Peter has said, that not everything he says will reach the infallible level of dogma. Okay. He can make a casual remark in his Wednesday afternoon sermon that he gives at the Vatican. That's certainly not infallible. Why? Well, it's because Peter said it's not going to be infallible. Peter said it's only going to be infallible when I fulfill 4 criteria. And those criteria were laid out in Pastor Aeternus at Vatican Council I under Pius IX. Okay? So the church qualified when and when it would not speak infallibly. But when it did, that's when heaven would say, yes, and we will bind it also because it's infallible. All right? So there you have it. As for tradition from the apostles, apostolic oral tradition, 1 Thessalonians 2:13 says that Paul says to the Thessalonians, he says, you accepted when I preached to you as it being the word of God. Okay? In other words, there were times when Paul was not writing scripture, but he was speaking. And he was inspired by the Holy Spirit to speak those words. Okay? Just as happened when Jesus was dealing with the apostles, and he says, when you are brought before the governors and the rulers, don't worry about what you will say, because I will give you the words to say. Now that's also inspiration. Okay? Whenever God intrudes into the human mind and takes whatever vocabulary is there and forms it such that it is now divine, that's inspiration. And that can happen when someone speaks or when someone writes. Very special times. Okay? Now, the church limits the other thing is to say, if it's inspired, then guess what? It's infallible, because God can't lie. Okay? God's not going to give a mistruth if he's inspiring the individual, whether he's inspiring them to speak or to write. Okay? So that's why the church, and here again, the church is limiting itself, because Peter has the power to do that. He's going to say tradition is only infallible when we can prove that it comes from the apostles, who we know were inspired by God to speak what they spoke at various occasions. Okay? So we have to make sure we abide by that, because the danger is to say that any tradition of the Catholic Church, candles, vestments, Latin, whatever, is a tradition, an infallible tradition of the church. No. Okay. They're traditions because they just happen to be there for a long time, but they're not infallible traditions. Okay. Infallible traditions only deal with revelation from God, not how we conduct our Catholic faith. Okay. So those are our other two sources of infallible information. And Paul backs this up in 2 Thessalonians 2:15. He goes, whatever I have written or whatever I said is the tradition. Okay? In other words, it's not just writing scripture, it's also him speaking. Okay? 2 Thessalonians 2:15. That's very important also to tie everything together. Okay? So there you have it. All right. See, did I get everything? Yeah. Okay. How does God reside in us? Question from Marcus. How is it different from demonic possession? Well, I think you answered your own question. You know a demon is a spirit, right? And you know demons can come into a human body and reside there, right? Okay. So the same thing with God. God in his spirit, whatever portion of his spirit God wants to give us. Okay. And we know that's possible from scripture because, well, we don't want to get into that right now, but that's the way it would happen. Okay. God's spirit comes in us the same way any spirit would come into a human body. Now, we don't know anything beyond that. We just know that it's possible. Okay. So that's as far as we can take it. All right. It is 5:00. So, Peter, I'm sorry I can't get to your question, and it's regarding Melchizedek and all that. If you have, Peter, since I'm cutting you off here, if you have my commentary, volume, that would be volume 4, which is 2 Timothy to the Apocalypse. Okay. I cover your question in the commentary. Melchizedek, Hebrews 7:3, he had neither beginning of days nor end of life, all that stuff. I cover that in the commentary. So if you don't have the commentary, you need to get it. Okay. Which brings me to the end. And for those of you who are familiar with the commentary I'm talking about, I have a commentary. I'm almost done with it. I'm working on the last volume. It comes in 4 volumes. The first volume, 700 pages on Matthew, Mark, and John. The second volume is Luke and Acts. That's going to be another 750 pages. And that's the one I'm finishing up right now. I'm finishing up the book of Acts right now. So it's going to take a few months to get that on the market. Volume 3 is Romans to 1 Timothy. Okay? And that's 700 pages. And the next one, volume 4, is 2 Timothy to the Apocalypse, which is also 700 pages. So all in all, it's about 300 pages, 3,000 pages of commentary. And the one I was just referring to was volume 4, where it talks about Hebrews and Melchizedek. And that's for sale on robertsongenis.org. So, do I have a sample of it here? Yeah. Here we go. That is the one on Romans to 1 Timothy. I'm sorry. Yeah, Romans to 1 Timothy. Now, I should say volume 3 there. It says volume 2 because that was a mistake. But there it is, okay? And so you can get that. And we also had put out a new edition of The Galileo Was Wrong, 3 volumes. Yeah, I forgot to tell you guys about this. So I went and edited it again, all 2,200 pages. And then I found out that my bookmaker was giving a new price on color editions. The color editions of Galileo Was Wrong used to cost $200 a piece. But they have a new system for color editions that we got down to, $50 or so. So you can get all 3 original Galileo Was Wrong editions, which is all of them now are in their 12th edition. And you can get the color edition hardback. And we're not selling them in paperback. You can get them in hardback color editions. That means all the pictures are in color, all the graphs are in color, the charts are in color, everything's in color, unless I used a black and white photo. Okay. For what is it, $189, I think it is. And for that, you also get the PDFs. Okay. 3 PDFs. So that's a good deal. I mean, people who bought the color edition before paid like $600. And sell many of them, but we sold some, and that was a lot of money. So now you're getting them for less than a third of that price. So take advantage of it. We also put out the 7th edition of Geocentrism 101. I edited that one as well, 250 pages. And that's all we have new, except for, as I said, if you're late, this is available now. How the World Was Made in 6 Days. Day 1 covers Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, and it's available on streaming. The DVDs will be here in a week or so. So if you've ordered one, and I have a few orders on my desk here, you just have to wait a little bit. Okay? So that's all the new stuff. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you for being here with me. And I did make it through, even though I'm sick. And the Lord helped me there, I'm sure. Okay, take care. We'll see you next week, February the 15th.